Right, so today my search for transformational objects takes me to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, where I'm meeting with Dr. Ayesha Fuentes, who is the Isaac Newton Trust Research Associate in Conservation.
That's true.
Hello, Ayesha.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And thanks so much for having this conversation with me.
I'm very happy to be here.
Great. And I believe that you've got an object that you would like to share with us and tell us about the project. What might that be?
I do. So I have a drum, and the drum comes from the Baganda people who are in present-day Uganda. The drum is associated with a war god, and it was displaced from Uganda in 1920 by a man named Reverend John Roscoe. He was a missionary, and he wrote a book called The Baganda. But the drum itself is now in the collection out at offsite storage. So it's not actually here in the museum, and it's not actually on display. I don't think it's ever been on display in the museum, which is important as well.
Part of the story.
Part of the story, yeah. So I think if you go into the galleries, you see a few drums, but what you don't see are the 500 other drums.
Wow.
That are part of the collection. So I think that's why I wanted to start with that, to really, especially a drum is like a very, salient, it has a voice, it has a very distinct voice. But this particular drum, I wanted to talk about it because it came up in the course of our storage move. So our museum right now is in the process of moving all of our offsite storage, all of the objects in our offsite storage from one site, which is an old building in West Cambridge, to a new site, which is actually the former Cambridge nuclear bunker. This is a project of about 300,000 objects. We're going through all of the objects. It takes about 5 years. And I myself am not doing this alone. Obviously, there's a big team that's working on it. So there are 9 collections assistants who are just an incredible group of people. They go through the objects, and as they go through the objects, they take a photo of each of them, and then they try to make a record. So if there's any information that we can find about the object, they add that to the online database so that people can learn more about the work that we're doing as we're actually discovering these objects. Because many of them, I would say the majority of them, have never been photographed. They've never been exhibited. They've never been written about. And a lot of them haven't been handled since they came to the collection 100 years ago.
I mean, that's really kind of sad or poignant that I can just picture all of these objects almost languishing in these storages.
That's exactly what it is.
And with all these histories and stories to tell, and yet they're kind of invisible, or, as you say, silent in this case.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, maybe it's because my father's a musician, I am a music lover. Something about the musical instruments, there's something about that that's particularly sad to me, to have silent musical instruments and the drums especially, because there's some of these instruments are very specialist, and some of these instruments aren't meant to be played by everybody. We definitely, are sensitive to that. But something like a drum, it's so accessible. It's something anyone could hear. It's something that anyone who comes to the museum, you come into a museum and you want to know what something sounds like. Anyway, this particular drum, I have a habit while we're walking around, while we're going through all of these objects, that if someone brings me a drum, I always tap it. So I play it because it tells me a lot about how, the condition of the drum. If it sounds like a drum or if it doesn't sound right, you're like, there's something's going on here. So it's not a violent thing. I just give it a light tap. And this particular drum had a weird kind of white patch on the surface. It looked a bit like kind of what you would imagine as a kind of a standard barrel drum, where you've got the skins over the top and you've got the skins over the bottom, and you've got these kind of twisted thongs along the side as tensioning. So, and you've got, probably animal skins, probably cattle skin on the top and on the bottom. But then on the top, there was this weird white patch about the size of like 2 hands widths apart. And it was weird, and it was kind of plasticky feeling, and it didn't look right. It had a different texture from everything else. But then when I tapped the drum head as well, the drum didn't sound right. Like it had a horrible sound. It didn't ring. It was just, we were like, okay, well, this is definitely a weird choice. You know what I mean? Like it's a weird choice to put this weird other rigid hide section, this weird patch in the middle of a drum head. Like who would do that? So the collection assistant who was looking at it, she started digging into it. So we're like, well, this is a very strange, change that has happened. This is a strange alteration in the object. So we want to pursue this and see if it tells us something about the object's history. So she found this photo of the drum turned upside down, and around it, there were a series of objects. And this is a very old photo, so unfortunately it's not super helpful, but we could see these different kind of like blobby bits. It's a black and white photo. And she looked at it and she thought, this woman's name, by the way, is Eleanor Beestin-Sheriff, and she's an absolute delight to work with, so I want to make sure that she gets credit for this work, because I did not do this. But she looked into the object, and she looked into the record, and she found this photo, and she was looking at it, and she recognized actually one of the weird little blobs that was like next to it in this historic photo, next to the drum. And she was like, I saw that object. I remember that object from before, because she's been processing these objects for 3 years now. And she just happened to remember that she had come across this 1 in 300,000, that she remembered this other piece of the drum. And she found it in our records. It had been given a different number, and there was no record of it having been removed from the drum. There was no record, and I'm talking about our museum record, so our database. There was nothing in our database that said this drum had been altered in this way. And then there was nothing in the database that said that object had come from this drum. So they were completely dissociated. So we were able to at least relink them and say, okay, definitely this is that thing, that came from that. But the rest of the objects, unfortunately, we haven't been able to find. We just know that this happened, and that really seems to indicate that this weird white patch that's on top of the drum, and the reason why it doesn't sound like a drum anymore, is because at some point after this object came back to the UK, it was opened, its contents were emptied, and then someone patched it. And whoever patched it was obviously not a drum maker, so they actually weren't a skilled specialist. I don't know who they were, and I'm sure they were doing their best job, but it doesn't hold up as a drum anymore. Now it's something else. It's something that's been changed.
So it's been dislocated, moved from its original home, its original context, its original environment, the people who would have made it and constructed it and used it in whatever way, taken back over here, stored, kind of lost about, put into storage, but also, as you say, taken apart, the contents taken out, and not repaired terribly well. It's not a terribly happy trajectory so far.
No, and it's not, and I think the story that we like to tell ourselves is that museums, especially as museum professionals, is that museums are good places for objects, that museums are safe places for objects, and that we are practicing the best possible standard of care. Like, it couldn't be any better than having something in a museum. But they're here, they're being stored in these big numbers where we don't actually have the capacity to engage with all of them and to really deliver that standard of care. Like I said, this is 300,000 objects. There's one person who's in charge of all of them, who's the manager, and it's not me. I'm just the person who's in charge of like making decisions about treating them or repairing them, which I do very, very rarely. So that displacement that John Roscoe and a lot of colonial era anthropologists they moved this materials, you really have to get into their heads about what were they thinking? What was their intention? How long was this object meant to live? And what was meant to be, I keep saying value and utility, but like, what was meant to be its value in the long term here in this setting? And
what do you think, have you got any answers to that? What do you think he was intending by doing what he did?
I can't climb into the head of someone who would displace material like that. Like, I'm the kind of person when I travel, I don't even take photos of human beings because I think it's a bit rude. So like, the idea that you would acquire someone else's material heritage in order to answer your own curiosity is very foreign to me. And the idea that you would have like a mandate to do that, and that you would feel you were an instrument of doing that on behalf of an institution like Cambridge or a colonial administration, like, the British at the time, I was like, I can't access that.
It does seem like a very, well, I was going to say a different mindset and a distant mindset. Hopefully so, but maybe not so. I mean, I don't know if, I'm sure probably acts of cultural appropriation are still going on, but is there a kind of happy ending to the story, or is what happens next?
I do think part of I think it's a positive outcome that we were able to reassociate these two objects in our collection and to also to narrate this story, because before it was just a weird sounding drum with a weird patch on it, and then there was some other stuff that maybe existed in the collection. So now we actually have like a narrative, and that's very helpful, especially because our museum right now is engaged with the Ugandan cultural authorities. We've had a delegation actually come to visit and to actually look through our collections, these very collections that were displaced by this particular collector, and actually talk about repatriation as an option and start to build a list of things that they would like back to come back into their care. On our end, that looks like making sure that they have a complete list and that they have access to all of the same information that we have access to. That's a huge project when we're looking at hundreds of objects that have, some of which have been displaced. And as the story that I just illustrated, I mean, some of these objects they've just disappeared into the collection. And it's going to take a lot of work to actually track down what happened to them and actually reunite, for example, all of the bits of the drum and put them back in. I don't know what'll happen to it when it goes back to Uganda. It doesn't matter. It doesn't necessarily concern me. But like, this is a damaged object. You know what I mean? I think we have in our mind that like people want the Elgin marbles, or they want the Benin bronzes, and they want these objects that are generally in pretty good shape. They're generally fairly valuable, for example. But this drum is now it's a drum that's like many, many others, but it has this particular story. It has a particular value to them that they have access to, that's part of their story. And then it is also part of our story in terms of an institution, but also the way in which the UK holds these collections that have been assembled over the past, couple hundred years. So I think the happy ending for me is that the value of that object, despite the fact that really at some point someone did something that didn't age well, it's an alteration that doesn't look great now. It's something that we look at and we go, well, that's kind of damaged. It doesn't look good for the institution in terms of how we care for objects. But the fact is, to the colleagues in Uganda, it was still a viable object. And no, this still has value. Bring it back, and honestly, I hope they repair it. And replace the drum head, because then it could possibly be a drum again.
Well, also, I mean, in the context of kind of like transformation and transformative objects, I mean, it seems like the whole repatriation is a very current, and it's great to hear these stories, and great that some of these reparations, as it were, are being made. And that's kind of a good news story in itself. It is a transformation. It's kind of almost like come full circle from that sense of dislocation.
I really hope so.
And I am curious as to how then it will be received at the other end. It's not my story anymore, or it's never been my story, but it isn't, obviously it's entirely for them. But it is curious to know then, because you can't go back in time. You can't put it back into its environment where it once was.
Exactly.
So it's either going to go into another museum, or maybe it's going to go back to the community from where it came, and so on. So it feels very much like this ongoing process. And also with the number of objects that potentially are up for consideration, and not just this institution, but across
everywhere.
The country.
Exactly.
It's just this huge, and I think it's really just the start of something new that people are trying to come to grips with. You do hear quite a lot of resistance from some quarters. Has it been the idea of repatriation? Is it something that is controversial or being resisted, or would you say that it's being embraced?
I mean, from my perspective, and from in this institution, it's very much embraced. And I have to say that's a really nice thing about being based at an institution like that. They're very much invested. So like the Benin part, they've repatriated a number of objects, and they've done so for decades. So issues of repatriation, especially in a museum like this that does hold ethnographic collections, it's absolutely part of what we do. And as part of the Stores Move project, that is a huge goal, because one of the key obstacles to repatriation is that many of us and museums, and I'm talking about MAA, I'm talking about other ethnographic collections in the UK, and even kind of the bigger encyclopedic, like national museums, like the British Museum, we don't actually know what we have. We have so much material that, I think the British Museum is definitely like 1%, 3%, something like that. It's far less than 10% of the material that they own that's actually on display. And here I wouldn't be surprised if the number was the same. So some of these objects were collected by people like John Roscoe or other people who were, traveling for whatever reason. They bring these objects back, and maybe they keep them at home, and then when they pass on, their children will donate them to the museum, or maybe they donate them directly. That tends to be how things come in. But they don't always some of these collectors don't always take great notes. And within the museum, because we have so much material, and because so much material has been acquired so quickly in the past 150 years, we've grown at a rate that we haven't been able to, again, maintain that standard of care, but we don't even know what we have. So I think at least 400 objects that are labeled world unprovenanced. how do you start with that? You know, I mean, and I have things that are unprovenanced, and maybe it's, you know, if it's something like a bronze, if it's something like an 18th century painting, you know, there are questions that you can engage with, but I get like sticks, just a stick. You know what I mean? And it's like, where did the stick come from? Maybe it's part of another object. Maybe it fell off of something. Maybe it was taken out of a drum. Like, you know, where did the stick come from? And there are things that I can do. There are, you know, sciencey things that I can do. I can take samples and I can date things and I can ask specialists and things like that. But that information is really slow in coming to anthropology collections. There's a lot more attention for it in archaeological sciences when we're trying to figure out who was making gold where, you know, 3,000 years ago, or, you know, which paintings moved during the Second World War and who took them and resold them and things like that. There's a lot more attention for that. There's a lot more scholarship and technical knowledge there. Me sitting in a room with 300,000 sticks trying to figure out where they came from because someone went on holiday to, you know, Burma and then came back. It's like, this is a really complex problem, and I just even trying to draw attention to it is, you know, one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here and to talk about it. Because I need help, you know what I mean? And I feel like that's an important thing to hear as well, because like I hear from the outside museum, and especially students are great about this. They're like, repatriate it. When is the repatriated? You know, that's the punchline to everything is like, when is it going to get repatriated? And like, as soon as I figure out where it's from, and I'm really trying to do that as quickly as possible. But like I said, I have 300,000 objects and some of them are just sticks.
Yeah, fascinating, and a completely different angle that you don't always hear about. That actually, it's just not as easy as you might think, and you know, you can't just pack it up and send it first class.
I'd love to, honestly, I would, but like, and to whom do you send it? That's a whole other question, because the way that repatriation works, people have to make a claim, and they have to make a claim to us, and that claim has to be represented by some kind of recognizable authority.
But how would they even know to make a claim if they don't know that the object exists?
Yes, exactly. Which is one of the huge. Which is exactly this is the starting point. Is I not me personally, but we have to take a photo of everything and get it out there.
I was going to say, almost like put it online, put it on.
And Twitter, it has been so. Yeah. And that's what's amazing about this particular storage project is like they've been very active on social media. So if anyone wants to follow Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, we're on Twitter and on Instagram, and they've been really good about really illuminating some of the objects that they found. And these are objects that, again, they've never been on display, they've never been written about. No one ever accesses them, and it's really beautiful to actually see them come alive, and especially through these collections assistants who, it's a group of, at the moment, it's 9 women, or it has been 9 women, between the ages of like 20 and 30. And they all come from these amazing, you know, backgrounds. One is interested in music, and one is interested in weapons, and one is interested in archaeology. And, they all have a really keen interest in the collection and their own particular perspective on it.
Well, that's, that really is behind the scenes at the museum, as it were, isn't it? Now, I know that, sadly, you're not able to let us induct the drum itself into our little library of objects.
Yes, sad. I'm sorry. Well, hopefully it's on its way back to Uganda, so that's the best possible reason.
Yes, exactly. But I believe that maybe we can borrow, use some other packing material that you are going to let us have for the purposes of our little library of objects.
I think that would be really fun, because so as we're processing these objects, and again, as a lot of them have never been accessed since they were brought into the collection in the first place, we're finding a lot of the historic packing materials and a lot of the containers that these objects were transferred in. So some of the things that we're finding, for example, are like Victorian medicine chests that have been reused as object packaging. We find historic newspapers. So we found newspapers from throughout the world wars, for example. And those are always really entertaining. Just for like a slice of life kind of thing. You look at the stories and they're not much different. It's pretty amazing. It's like food rationing and like everyone's cold. And you're like, wow, plus ça change. But so the just looking at like the historical continuity of being here, but also just looking at these old packing materials and seeing what museum professionals were doing 60 years ago or 80 years ago, and knowing the entire time, being very aware that in 80 years, when hopefully they do this again, they're going to open the boxes that we've packed and be like, what is this? You know, they're going to look at it and be like, is this the best that you could do at the time? So I think that's also really helpful for just remembering that we're only one part in this long process of care for material heritage, and also that museums are only one expression of that. So I think we have the idea that museums are kind of a finalized document, but really they're very much a work in progress.
Well, certainly this project has been great for me to hear stories of objects and how objects have been reanimated, as you say, in terms of just hearing their stories, hearing how they came to be where they are, how they've made changes to us or told stories of change. Well, it's fantastic, and so thank you very much for sharing the story of the drum with me, and I'm going to be curious now to see how that story does finish up.
So am I, you know, I mean, I think whatever I can do to prepare the drum for its journey, I think that's also a very important thing, especially conservators like me are thinking about. You know, a lot of times we've put accession numbers on objects, or we've made changes to them, you know, and are we going to have to undo that work? Or is it really out of our hands because that next step in the journey, that's not up to us. That's up to another custodian somewhere else who maybe has a more appropriate expertise at this moment to solve that problem, which, you know, I don't, and I'm okay with that.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for giving me a chance to talk about it.